Hi, welcome to Talent Sprint. In this session, we will look at how to analyze logical arguments. And for this, you will need to evaluate a piece of reasoning. Now, why is this so important to understand or know different types of critical reasoning questions? One, it saves time. Now, you can avoid rereading the question or read the question quickly to watch out for keywords that indicate the purpose of the question. Two, you just get familiar with reducing errors. What do I mean by this? When you're familiar with different types of critical reasoning questions, you're less likely to make careless mistakes. Now we're going to look at 5 such different questions covering verbal critical reasoning. 1. Assumptions. 2. Arguments. 3. Course of action. 4. Cause and effect. And 5. Inference. Now before we look at these 5 question types, let me introduce you to some basic concepts without which resolving such questions is going to pose a challenge. The first one is language. Now, if your language proficiency is not reasonable, my friend, then you're in trouble. Let's take a look at this example, for instance. Consider this question. It says, consider the statement and the following assumptions and decide which of the assumptions is implicit in this statement. Getting stuck somewhere? What does the word implicit mean? Well, like I said, if you don't know the meaning of the word implicit, then it's going to be difficult for you to proceed forward. By the way, implicit means implied or understood, thought, not directly expressed. So moving on, we have the second thing that you need to be familiar with, which is inference. Now what is that now? To infer, meaning to make logical conclusions based on factual evidence or premises known or assumed to be true. So now that you have a reasonable idea on what to focus on, I think this is a good premise to begin with. Let's get started, shall we? So our next question type is course of action. Now what's a course of action? A course of action is, sequence of activities or a possible plan, right, which is taken for improvement or follow-up or further action in regards to a problem on the basis of the information given in the statement. So you will have a statement followed by 2 courses of action. So we have to assume everything in the statement is true and then decide which course of action will logically follow suit. So let's take a look at this example right here. So our statement is, some of the Indian star players have reportedly expressed reservation about touring state X to security reasons following the terrorists' threats. This is our statement. So we assume that all of this is true. Now let's look at our 2 courses of action. The first course of action says, Indian Cricket Board should send a delegation to state X to assess the situation in the various venues where the matches are to be played. That's the first course of action. The second course of action, it says, the tour should be postponed immediately. Now, we have to see what can be the logical course of action that should be taken so that there is a solution to the problem, right? That's the end result. So, if you look at the statement, are all of the Indian star players having a problem? No, some of them. Okay, so keep that in mind. Also, we know what the reason is. There have been some terrorist threats, so they don't want to take a chance, right? So they're expressing reservation about going to that particular state. We understand the premise. Let's look at our first course of action. Indian Cricket Board should send a delegation to state X to assess the situation in the various venues where the matches are to be played. Now in this first course of action, it proves to be pretty logical, right? Some of them have expressed this. We still value that and we still want to check if the current situation is continuing to pose a threat or not. So the best logical or possible solution for this particular situation is to send someone to assess the situation. This seems like a very logical thing to do. But the second course of action, the tour should be postponed immediately, I don't think it serves a purpose or it's actually bringing in a solution to the situation at hand, right? One is because unless and until without verification, knowing what the current status is, why would you want to postpone the tour? It might incur a lot of cost and time, right? We don't want to do that. That's not a very logical solution. So I'm going to go with 1. Remember, our options are only course of action 1 follows, or option 2 only course of 2 follows, or action 3 either course of action 1 or course of action 2, or option 4 neither of them, and option 5 both. So for this situation, I'm going to go with option 1, which is only the first course of action applies or follows logically, provided the situation in the statement. Okay, let's look at our next statement. So our next statement: the concert by Bryan Adams, scheduled for Saturday evening, is expected to see roads in and around XYZ Stadium in City X, witnessing heavy traffic between 4 p.m. and midnight. Again, we assume each of these to be true, right, from the statement. Let's look at our first course of action. For that period, commuters should be diverted to other roads. Okay? Any language, words hampering meaning? What are commuters? Commuters are people who travel either by bike or car, right? Commuting means traveling, whatever transport that you use. How do you commute? I commute by bus or train or bike, right? Second course of action: considering the large gathering, there should be alternative management of parking the vehicles. So we have these two courses of action. Again, we'll have to see which one of these two is logically, should take place, right? Or only one, or only two, or either one or two, or neither one or two, or both, right? Now, given the situation at hand, when there is something happening, a major event happening at a particular place, it only makes logical sense for you to direct the traffic, to other areas, so there's not much of congestion happening there. So the first one looks pretty logical. The second one, again, keeping in mind that there is going to be a large gathering at that place, you will have to make sure that there is enough space for parking. Right? What if that venue will not be able to hold that huge gathering? Then you have to look at alternate measures. And that's exactly what the second course of action says. Considering the large gathering, there should be alternative management of parking the vehicles. So if you see, both these courses of action logically follow suit, given the statement. On the basis of what we have in the statement, right, both these two courses of action will logically apply. So for me, I'm going with option 5, where both 1 and 2 will logically follow suit given the situation at hand. Alright? Let's move to our next statement. Our next statement here states, the hygienic condition of the city X is not good. Polythenes and garbage are littered all over. Alright, so this is our statement. Let's look at our first course of action. The hygienic condition of the city X is a problem which has been persisting over a long time and can't be improved immediately. Alright. Our second course of action: NGOs and Nagar Nigam should start a cleanliness movement. Now this is a pretty simple one, right? We already know what a course of action is. A course of action is a possible plan. Now if you look at the first course of action, it is not even a course of action. It's just reiterating the statement, giving me extra information for how long it's been happening without a possible plan. There's no plan here. It just reiterates the statement. But on the other hand, the course of action 2 very clearly gives me a plan. What's the plan? I think NGOs and Nagar Nigam should start a cleanliness movement. Now this is setting some sequence of activities that will help the situation. Now this is a logical plan, right? So for me, from the options, I know immediately that only option 2 will fit the bill, right? So if you ask me, option 2 is the logical course of action to follow based on the information that we have in the statement. Let's move to our next statement. Our next statement: a phone was received at the district control office from an anonymous person that there was a deadly bomb in the secretariat. This is our statement. Now, again, anonymous means somebody unknown, right? Somebody. Let's look at our first course of action. Bomb defusing squad should be sent immediately. Second course of action: the authority should not give any heed to this type of hoax. What's a hoax? A hoax is like a practical joke, a trick. Somebody played a prank. That's a hoax. Now, we need to see again what's the possible plan, right? Based on the information that we have in the statement. Now, if we look at the first course of action, bomb defusing squad should be sent immediately. Now, irrespective of whether it is true or not, you don't want to take the risk, right? if you receive an anonymous phone call like this, whether because you don't want to take a risk, you want to go ahead and do this, which is to check, to assess the situation, right? So this seems like a more logical plan. But the second one, the authority should not give any heed to this type of folks. No, we can't make any assumptions when something as critical as this happens, right? Again, like I said, you can't take a risk. So this does not seem like a logical course of action. You cannot ignore something as critical as a phone call stating there is a deadly bomb. You can't ignore that. So the first course of action applies and follows suit logically based on the information provided to us in the statement. Let's look at one more statement. Our final statement for course of action. The epidemic of porno websites is spreading in India and thus harming Indian youths by degrading their moral and ethical values. So we assume all of this to be true. Epidemic, spreading extensively, rapidly, right? Like an outbreak, uncontrollable. Okay, let's look at our first course of action. Cabin facilities should not be given to internet users. Okay, our second course of action. Porno sites should not be allowed to be free sites. Now let's address the first course of action. Cabin facility should not be given to internet users. Basically what they mean is a secluded cabin. Now generally, the mindset of people is, if I have to do something that I don't want anybody to see, it becomes easier for me to do it if it's in a secluded place, right? Like in closed rooms. So, but it is less likely for me to do something wrong when I'm open to public. Public can see me and they can judge me. So I wouldn't do that. So this seems like a logical plan, right? When I don't give you a secluded cabin, which means people sitting next to you can see what sites you're opening, less likely that you would open this site. Okay? Second course of action. Porno sites should not be allowed to be free sites. This also seems logical. Why? Because anything free you don't think twice. You add a cost to it, there is a pinch, right? You feel the pinch. Am I spending a little too much on this? Is it required? Right? And you think twice before, and some people don't even have the money to spend. Like, school kids will not have the money to go ahead and watch these sites. Right? So, this seems like a very, very logical course of action for me. So, I would say, given the statement that we have, right, both these course of actions would be logical, right? So here ends course of action. Let's look at our next question type, which is cause and effect. Our fifth question type for verbal critical reasoning is inference. So what is inference? Inference is deriving logical conclusions from the given facts, or it's an act of reasoning from factual knowledge or evidence. So the question pattern will be such that there will be a passage and then we will have 4 or 5 questions, or rather statements, and then we'll have to see if these statements, we're going to infer if these statements apply under 5 or 6 options. We're going to look at what those options are from the passage. So for example, if the statement inferred is definitely true based on the facts from the passage, I will click option 1. If the statement is probably true, right, we don't have all the information but slight or relevant information is available, then we will click option 2 if it's probably true. Now, if the statement given wherein the data is inadequate or insufficient, we need some more information, then we will click option 3, data inadequate or insufficient. For option 4, if the statement inferred is probably false, then we will go ahead and click option 4, and option 5 is when the statement inferred is definitely false, meaning to say that we cannot possibly draw this inference simply because it contradicts the facts given in the passage. Then I will go ahead and click option 5, which is definitely false. So we understand what we need to do. We have a passage, we will have 4 or 5 statements. We have to make sure if those statements fall under any of these options: definitely true, probably true, inadequate data, probably false, or definitely false. So let's go ahead and look at our first passage. A recent report that satellite data shows groundwater levels in northern India depleting by as much as a foot per year over the past decade is a matter of concern. The clear writing on the wall is that India faces a turbulent water future and veritable crisis without proactive policy and sustainable practices. Besides the poor monsoon this season and the resultant drought situation, Pan-India calls for sustained policy focus on the water economy. A whole series of glaring anomalies do need to be addressed. For one, there's far too much reliance on groundwater. For another, our water infrastructure for storage and supply is sorely inadequate. Worse, policy distortions in artificially underpricing answers agri-inputs like power has perversely incentivized cultivation of water-intensive crops like paddy in traditionally wheat-growing areas. Now let's understand if there are certain words that are hindering our meaning of the context, right? So what is the meaning of turbulent? Turbulent means disturbing, right? It causes some sort of unrest. Just imagine in the future, if you're going to have inadequate water, that's disturbing news, correct? And what about veritable? Veritable crisis. What does veritable mean? It's a real crisis. It's a crisis that's extremely genuine, right? And what about anomalies? Well, anomalies is deviation or departure from the actual or common form or rule or order, right? So we've gone ahead and looked at certain words which we think will be posing a problem for us in terms of meaning and understanding the context as the whole. Now let's go ahead and look at certain statements and see from the given passage if those statements are definitely true, probably true, maybe there's insufficient data, or probably false or definitely false. So let's look at our first statement. India has failed to take measures to recharge groundwater adequately in northern part. Now that's our statement 1. Now I can go ahead and definitely say this is option 1 simply because the first sentence answers this, right? It says a recent report that satellite data shows groundwater levels in northern India depleting by as much as a foot per year over the past decade is a matter of concern. So we know for the last 10 years this has been a problem, but nobody has done anything. So when I say India has failed to take measures to recharge groundwater adequately in the northern part, we know for a fact that this is there in our passage. That's the first line. So yes, this will fall under option 1 where this statement is definitely true from the facts given in the passage. Let's look at our second statement. The second statement reads, wheat cultivation in India requires comparatively more water than paddy. Now here again this is an easy one because it completely contradicts the fact that is given in the passage. And where do you find this in the passage? In the last line. The last line very clearly says, power have perversely incentivized cultivation of water intensive crops like paddy in traditionally wheat growing areas. So we know that water is more required for paddy and not wheat. But what does the statement say? It says wheat cultivation in India requires comparatively more water than paddy. So it contradicts the fact in the passage. So which means it will be option 5. Right? Option 5 is where it is definitely false because it contradicts the facts in the passage. Let's move to statement 3. Statement 3 says, water level in other parts of India is stable during the last decade. Now we know that in the northern part there has been some problem. They haven't done anything. It's depleting a foot, every year, right? But we do not have enough information in the passage telling us what is happening in other parts of India. So this will definitely have to fall under option 3 where I'm saying there is inadequate data. There is not enough information supporting this statement. So statement 3, water level in other parts of India is stable. Sorry, we do not have enough information, so it will come under option 3. Let's look at our fourth statement. The fourth statement says, India has now put in place a system to reduce over-dependence on groundwater. Again, this is a clear answer. In the passage, it says there's far too much reliance on groundwater. It's contradicting the statement, right? The statement says India has now put in place a system to reduce over-dependence on groundwater. That's not the case. What is happening? We're relying too much on groundwater. That's what the passage says. Which means here again, the facts in the passage is contradicting the statement. This will come under option 5. Definitely false. Let's look at our last statement. The last statement says, adequate monsoon helps in drawing less groundwater for cultivation and thus preserves balance. Now, we all understand that in the passage we have some information around that, right? The passage says, besides the poor monsoon this season and the resultant drought situation, Pan India calls for sustained policy water measures. So, having said that, I know for a fact that less monsoon, we rely more on groundwater. So, if there's adequate monsoon, there are chances where we don't have to rely so much on groundwater. It makes logical sense. So here I would go ahead and say, there is information in the passage. It's probably true. Adequate monsoon helps in drawing less groundwater for cultivation, and thus there will be some sort of balance where we can manage the water resource, right? So I would go ahead and say this particular statement is probably true, if not completely, because there is some amount of information in the passage supporting the same. Alright, so this is the general pattern by which you will have to make inferences. Let's look at one more passage and understand this in detail. India seems to have arrived in terms of foreign institutional investors, FII, inflows. Just why are foreign investors turning to markets such as India? The general consensus is that the US currency outlook is not particularly good. So investors are looking to diversify their exposures and are moving into emerging markets. Investments in India saw better return on equity than all the other emerging markets at 18% last year. The average for other markets was about 11 to 12%. India's growth is largely because of the domestic market, with exports accounting for just 10% of its GDP, unlike China, which is much more dependent on exports and as a consequence is the US as a buyer. Okay, so this is our passage, right? So let's go ahead and look at our statements and then go ahead and see which option it falls under, right? Our first statement, India had not been a good market for foreign investors. So this is a statement. India had not been a good market for foreign investors. That's what it says. So do you think that's a possibility? And do we have enough information from the passage supporting this? Let's go ahead and look at the passage. See, if you look at the first line, it says India seems to have arrived, which means earlier maybe it was not that great. It has come to a position where foreign investors are beginning to notice India, an Indian market, right? And then again, the same line, it says foreign investors turning to markets such as India. So right now, there is a change, which means earlier, maybe they weren't even looking at Indian market, right, for investment. So I could go ahead and say, if not complete information, at least the first line is giving me some amount of information supporting this statement. So I will go with option 2 saying, the statement is inferred, which is probably true. Probably true because there's some information supporting this statement. Let's look at our second statement. The second statement says, investors will get huge profit from investments even in the emerging markets. This is the second statement. Again, if I see, the following statement itself, it says, or the next line it says, investors are looking to diversify their exposures and are moving into emerging markets. So why would they do something like that? Because probably they are expecting some sort of profits. Otherwise, investors will not invest there, right? If they're not going to gain anything. So again, here, if not complete information, there is some information. So I will say this is also option 2, where the statement inferred is probably true. Okay, let's look at our third statement. The third statement reads, return on equity in China was 11% in the last year. Okay. So they're specifically talking about China here. We have information where India did well, 18%, right? And it just says other parts, other markets, the average for other markets was about 11 to 12%. That's what it says. It doesn't say China did 11%. So for me here, the information given is inadequate. I can't go ahead and infer this statement from the passage because there's not enough information supporting this statement. So I will go with option 3, which says inadequate data. Let's move to our fourth statement. Fourth statement reads, thus US is the largest importer of Chinese goods. Clear winner, right? The last line of the passage, let's look at that. The last line says, unlike China, which is much more dependent on exports and as a consequence has US as the buyer. So we know that this is definitely true. 1, right? Option 1, this is definitely true because the last line supports this statement. We have direct proof. Let's look at our final statement. India's domestic market is one of the largest in the world. India's domestic market is one of the largest in the world. The information that we have is investments in India saw better return on equity than all the other emerging markets at 18% last year. But just with this information, we cannot go ahead and say that India's domestic market is one of the largest in the world. For that, we don't have enough information in the passage. So this will fall under option 3, where I'm saying the statement inferred has inadequate data. Data is insufficient. So I will go ahead and click option 3 for this. Alright. So keep in mind, when you are attempting question patterns of inference, it's very important for you to look at the passage and make sure you have enough facts supporting the information. And if it's not complete information, even if there is partial information, then it will form under or fall under probably true option 2. If not, you will have clear definitions for definitely false and definitely true. Definitely false, it will completely contradict. Definitely true, you will have ample information supporting the statement, and then you have probably true and probably false, right? So here ends verbal critical reasoning, where we've looked at 5 different question types: assumptions, arguments, course of action, cause and effect, and inference. Here ends the session on verbal critical reasoning. Thank you.